Good afternoon, everyone. If I could ask you to grab a seat. We're ready to get started after our lunch. I'm very pleased to introduce the Honorable Eric R. Swalwell. Congressman Eric Swalwell represents California's 15th Congressional District, which includes a large portion of the East Bay, where he grew up, attended the public schools there, and served his community. In November 2012, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Congressman Swalwell serves on the Committee on Space, Science, and Technology and is the ranking member of a subcommittee on energy. He also serves on the Committee on Homeland Security. I'm especially pleased to welcome him because he is a 2003 grad, government and politics major from the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at University of Maryland. So we're very proud of him. He's one of our alumni. At Maryland, he actually created the position of student liaison on the College Park City Council, so he showed his predilection for government service then quite clearly. After college, he graduated from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, and he currently serves on the Board of Visitors of the College of Behavioral Social Sciences at Maryland, and I'm very grateful for him. Congressman Swalwell.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean, and welcome. It is quite an honor to be here, and I see some of my former professors here who still are quite surprised that I'm standing before them as a member of Congress. I have to tell you, I ran in 2012, and I ran against a 40-year incumbent, and he said a lot of things during the campaign. One of them proved to be true. He said that if you elect Eric Swalwell to Congress, he will never even know where the bathroom is. That's how inexperienced he was. And like 2 weeks in, after wandering around the Capitol building, I thought to myself, damn it, he's right. I don't know anything about where anything is around here. And I've really enjoyed doing this job. I was a 2001 intern for Ellen Tauscher, who many of you I know served with. And she inspired me then. I worked in her office on September 11th, and I was moved by many of you who came together on the Capitol steps to sing God Bless America. And that moment of coming together inspired me to stay involved. And also, when I was at Maryland, I had the honor in 2002, I worked with Senator Joe Tidings. He and I were the co-chairs for Kathleen Kennedy Townsend's gubernatorial race that year, and that was the first real big race that I worked on. And I'm glad to see, Senator, that you're still very engaged and active, and I remember you challenged me and pushed me hard to get students to as many of those events as possible during that campaign, and it's an honor to be with you here today. It's also my honor to introduce our next guest, and that's Mark Shields. Mark is someone who has quite a story. And Mark, first, I just want to thank you for your service to our country. You enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, and once a Marine, always a Marine. Right, Mark? And Mark he's also attended, which is quite remarkable, 22 National Party conventions. 22 National Party conventions. He has worked and been a part of 9 different presidential administrations. And also, I want to just say, Mark, since 1988, has served as a contributor for the PBS NewsHour before he was with the Washington Post, where he began writing his column in 1979, which was later syndicated. Mark, you worked in Robert F. Kennedy's campaign in his Senate office in New York, and in his 1968 campaign, and I'm the only Democrat my family has ever known. And my dad reminds me often that not since he supported Robert F. Kennedy's 1968 campaign, which ended tragically in California on primary day, has he supported a Democrat. So we look forward to hearing you maybe sharing some of your experience there. Mark's inside knowledge of politics is unmatched, and we're very fortunate to have opportunity to hear his thoughts and insights. So please join me in welcoming Mark to the symposium. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate that introduction. It's far better than the introduction I received recently in Baltimore, where the Master of Ceremonies said simply, "Now for the latest dope from Washington, Mark Shields." And I'm grateful. I do want to say, in a spirit of, as King Henry VIII said to each of his 6 wives, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." I am here under false colors and false pretenses. My good friend John Lawrence, for whom I have the highest regard, asked me to discuss the press in the class of the 1974 Congress going forward. And as Eric touched on in the introduction, I am a political hack. My knowledge of the Congress and of that particular special group of members was fashioned in large part by political activism. I did work for Robert Kennedy. I worked for President Ed Muskie. I worked for Vice President Sergeant Shriver in '72 as well, and I worked for Congressman Mo Udall, who was maybe the high water mark of the House, if you think about it, in terms of commitment to the high regard that voters had. Mo Udall really dared to run for the House of Representatives. Just a marvelous, marvelous human being. He was once asked if he was handicapped, and he said, "I'm a one-eyed Mormon Democrat from Arizona." I don't know how many more handicaps you need than that. But he was just a marvelous figure. But what impressed me was the number of members of the House who supported him. When it's considered the support and admiration of your House colleagues was a plus, was a real advantage. It was even more so in 1988 when Dick Gephardt, then the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, ran for president, and 42 members of the House went to Iowa to campaign for him. And members like Dave Obey, who's here, and Marvin Leith, and Sandy Levin, and Martin Frost. I know I'll forget somebody, and I don't intend to. Steny Hoyer went out and actually took over congressional districts in his behalf. But coming back to what predated, or the context of that marvelous election of 1974 and the election of so many exceptional members, and was the 1973-1974 experience of Agnew and Nixon. Spiro Agnew, Spiro, could I have the envelope, please, Agnew, was the first vice president ever to have to resign. He mastered Latin. The plea was nolo contendere. And that left Richard Nixon with an opportunity that no president had faced before, and that was to appoint a vice president subject to congressional confirmation. And the next president of the United States, in large part, came directly from Congress, not just in his pedigree or his resume, but it was Carl Albert, the Speaker of the House, and Mike Mansfield, the Senate Democratic leader, who went to President Nixon. Senator Mansfield had first recommended John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, but then he and Carl Albert, at Carl Albert's initiative, agreed upon Jerry Ford to be the vice president and, in many respects, the president in waiting. And that obviously fashioned history. Just one little item, that is Jerry Ford had to fill the vice presidency. And he was urged by many in his inner council to pick Ronald Reagan. If he had picked Ronald Reagan, he would have avoided the primary challenge of 1976 and may very well have prevailed in what was an incredibly close race, where a switch of 17,000 votes in 2 states, Ohio and Mississippi, and Ford would have won an electoral vote victory over President Jimmy Carter. And Mike Deaver, who was in fact Ronald Reagan's amanuensis, told me that they lived in fear that Jerry Ford would offer Ronald Reagan one of two jobs. The first was the vice presidency, because they knew he would accept it, and therefore become part of the Ford team. The second he was even more concerned about was that Ford, in the shakeup of his cabinet later in 1975, heading into the 76 election, that he tossed several people overboard, you may recall, including Jim Schlesinger, and had a wholesale, Rockefeller went, and all the rest of it, that they offered Reagan the Secretary of Commerce's job. And Ronald Reagan was not interested in being Secretary of Commerce. And what Mike Deaver and Stu Spencer and others were confessed was they were afraid they'd offer him the ambassadorship to the Court of St. James. And if, in fact, it had been offered, Nancy Reagan would have accepted. And that would have ended that challenge. Let me just give you a quick sense of what led into my covering of this Congress and knowledge of it. I see David Cohen here, who has forgotten more about the Congress than virtually anybody else I know will ever learn, and from whom I have always had the wisest counsel and the greatest insight. Politics is nothing more and nothing less than the peaceable resolution of conflict among legitimate competing interests. I do not know, in a nation as big and broad and diverse as ours, how else we'd resolve our differences except through the political process. Compromise, which is the key to consensus, is fashioned by people in politics, staff, activists, and most of all, members. And without compromise, without consensus, we see the pain and the price of gridlock. I like people who run for political office. In my profession, that's considered heresy to acknowledge that. But for most of us, life is a series of quiet victories and quiet defeats. If you and I are the last two finalists to be the regional sales manager of Great Lakes Coat Hanger Company, and you get the promotion and I don't, when the local paper announces your success, they don't add Shields was passed over because of lingering questions about his expense account or his erratic behavior at the company Christmas party. But in politics, it's there for everybody you ever sat next to in study hall, double dated with, babysat for, to know whether you won or more likely you lost. I've always admired candidates who could lose with grace and with humor. In my half century, I've never seen anybody do it better than a fellow named Dick Tuck, who lost a very close state Senate race in Los Angeles. Vote came in, he had lost by 14 votes. When a radio reporter from KMPC radio in Los Angeles stuck a microphone in front of his face, he said, "How do you feel, Mr. Tuck?" And he said, "The people have spoken, the bastards." But I admire political courage. The first time I ever slept in the same quarters with African Americans or took orders from African Americans was at Parris Island, South Carolina in Marine Corps boot camp. And the only reason I did that was because the President of the United States, named Harry Truman, said in the final analysis, it's unacceptable and un-American to ask people to fight and possibly die for their country and then to segregate them by race. I admire, too, the courage of Ronald Reagan, who was about to mount his last run at the White House. If you recall, he had made a late run at Richard Nixon in 1968 and come up short at Miami Beach. 1976, he challenged President Ford. It went all the way to the convention in Kansas City. But in 1980, he was going to run. He was going to be 69 years old. That was going to be the ball game. But in his adopted home state, I see Norm Mineta, adopted home state of California, there was the Briggs Amendment. The Briggs Amendment was on the ballot. The Briggs Amendment, named for John Briggs, state senator from Orange County, would have made criminal the teaching in the public schools of California of anyone who was gay or homosexual. And it was leading in the polls. And Ronald Reagan came out against it. And Ronald Reagan said, that isn't how we judge our teachers in California. We judge them on whether our children learn in their classroom. And that and other people stood up, but it turned it around, and it was an act of political courage. So having had a president chosen, and I will say this, of all the presidents I have covered and known, Jerry Ford was the most emotionally healthy of any I've ever met. Why? People ask. Because most presidents I've met began sometime around the 3rd grade seeing themselves on Mount Rushmore. Jerry Ford had an absolutely unrealistic ambition to become Speaker of the House. There was nowhere near a Republican majority all the time he was in the House. Along the way, and accidentally, he became President of the United States. And he quite honestly, in my judgment, made a courageous and difficult political decision in pardoning Richard Nixon in 1974, perhaps costing him re-election in 1976. It brought down the wrath of the commentariat and the political world upon him, and in fact, he did do the right thing. But in 1974, when this remarkable group of youngsters came to Congress, the old politics had fallen into disrepair. Didn't like the establishment. They didn't particularly like Washington. They got elected criticizing Washington, which deserved criticism. This was after Vietnam and Watergate. There was an attitude on their part, and rightly so. We won on our own, not party guys. We're independent. And at that point, half the House Democrats had served 3 terms or less. There weren't any card games at the University Club. And the big fight on the Democratic side was between Phil Burton and Tip O'Neill as to who was going to be the next speaker. And it was a great, great fight. And probably determined the outcome. And for those of you who didn't know Phil Burton, he was an extraordinarily able, tireless, shrewd, and committed member of the House. And he was also his own greatest enemy. And that was his undoing in the final analysis. But we had this new Congress come and do so much of what had to be done and had never been addressed. To reform not simply the House, but to reform the entire culture of Washington. And it's a remarkable legacy in itself. I guess if I were to find fault with one legacy, unintended consequence of that great movement and the great people in it, was that we found out then what a strong theme anti-Washington could be. And that was taken to its ultimate in 1994, when we reached the point of the Republican Congress running against Washington. And now, if you suggest that your opponent is a politician, he'll countersue you for libel. It's reached that point in our politics. And I don't think there's any other profession in the world where somebody, if you were hiring a babysitter or a child, a nanny or whatever else, and the person came in for the interview and said, look, I have a PhD in child psychology. I've spent 6 years doing this, but I have to tell you, I really hate children. In the final analysis, that's the message. I hate Washington. I can't stand to be there. I don't like the people there. They're all ethically eunuchs and moral lepers. And once I accuse you, my colleague, of being immoral rather than uninformed or mistaken, you can see what the result is. The possibility of future consensus and compromise between us is reduced to non-existence. And that, I think, is a legacy particularly of 1994, that is with us and unfortunately is not to is a terrible price we've paid. Norm Warrenstein is here, for whom I have great regard. He and Tom Mann had I think, an incredibly important suggestion that the Congress be here in session from Monday to Friday of each week. Not for a cheap shot, they don't work hard enough. That is not the case, but simply on the basis that they get to know each other, that you know each other. When your kids go to school together, when you run into each other at a Little League game or a movie theater or the Safeway or whatever, you understand that the other person is a human being with a backstory that happens to be a family and happens to be other concerns. And I think it makes it tougher, quite honestly, for you to then to demonize that person. I see David Obey, whose campaign I worked on in 1969 when he won Mel Laird's seat, his special election. David Obey, I don't know if you're aware, is a remarkable scholar of history, and we were speculating if in fact in 1963, instead of President John Kennedy having been assassinated, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had been assassinated instead. And with that laser-like insight that Obey brings to so many problems, he said, there's one thing we could be sure of, Mark, if in 1963 Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated and not John Kennedy. I said, what's that, David? He said, Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So, and I will say this, that we have when our national political face is that of a congressional party, and right now, I think we saw last night in Simi Valley at the Reagan Museum, where people who run for the presidency begin not just by punching up on President Obama or Secretary Clinton, but going after the Republicans in Congress. You can see how any sense of compromise has been denigrated and has been discounted and disparaged to the point where it is, for those of us who care about the legislative process, it is in fact terrifying. I've always felt that the American people are philosophically conservative but operationally liberal. And by that I simply mean this. You ask Americans the abstract, what about the federal government? It's a pain in the neck. Too much red tape, get them off my back, out of my pocket. And you say, wow, those are pretty ardently conservative folks. But when told that a single can of tuna fish just outside of Pocatello, Idaho, has a taint of botulism in it, the universal American reaction is, where the hell was the federal government? I want a report in my office in 24 hours. I'm working on my side 24 hours a day, cheap, the federal government. And I just really think at that sense, and I say this as a charter member of former Democrats, I mean, because I'm now a pundit. I never knew what a pundit was. I'm not sure what one is, but so therefore I'm not active politically. But I would say the biggest mistake made by Democrats since '74 forward, and I didn't begin with them, is not to celebrate the successes of government. I mean, government, just take when Richard Nixon was president, and through great leadership on the Democratic Congress, particularly by Ed Muskie, by Udall and others, to fashion the first environmental acts of clean air and clean water. At the time, 4/5 of the rivers and streams in the United States were unswimmable and unfishable. The Great Lakes were dead. Marine life was gone. And we were told it was going to kill the American economy, destroy the American economy. And we embarked upon the Clean Water Act. It saved the Great Lakes, the greatest freshwater gift any people has ever been benefited by a generous providence. We went from 4/5 of the rivers and streams being unswimmable and unfishable to 4/5 being swimmable and fishable. And the Clean Air Act, the Wall Street Journal said, would end the American auto industry, and so did the Michigan delegation. We have taken 98% of the lead out of the air. Think about that. Think about children's lungs that are healthier and cleaner and lives that are fuller and richer because we did that. There are 22 million Americans every month who are kept out of poverty by Social Security. I mean, do we make mistakes? Absolutely. Is the VA a disgrace? Yes, and it should be corrected, and it has to be corrected. But I think the failure to celebrate, because Democrats, quite bluntly, and Ron Saracen knows this, because he was on the other side in Connecticut very effectively, Democrats are the party of government. And if you're going to argue about which party dislikes government the most, the Republicans are going to win that debate and that argument every time. I did watch the debate last night. I have to say, I have a soft spot for both Mike Huckabee and Chris Christie, because I'm tired of presidents with 28-inch waists. They're going to cross very soon. I mean, Huckabee going up and Christie going down in weight. But somebody asked me, how do you know when you've got a weight problem? You Chris Christie or Mike Huckabee. And the answer is very simple. When you're sitting in the bathtub and the water level in the toilet bowl starts to rise, you know you've got a weight problem. And I have to say, in watching that, I couldn't take my eyes off of either man. So the Congress, the 94th Congress was a remarkable institution. It took over this town. It became, in many respects, the face of the Democratic Party, and for good and for ill. In the decade of the 1980s, the Democratic nominees for president carried a total of 17 states out of 150. Jimmy Carter won 6 rather, Fritz Mondale won 1, and Michael Dukakis won 10. No party in history has ever survived defeats of that magnitude. So what we had presidents elected by essentially running against Congress, and then Congresses elected by running against the presidents. Tip O'Neill, whom I admired, respected, maybe loved, his era and his edict is no longer operable. Politics is not local. It's no longer local. It's been nationalized. Jimmy Carter came and basically in 1976 got elected in the post-Watergate by saying, look, I've never met Tip O'Neill or Howard Baker. I don't even know the leaders of the Congress. I've never been on a tour of the Capitol. I never took the LSAT test. Elect me to the highest political office. I'm not a politician. Sort of the functional equivalent of going down the Christian Science reading room to hire a neurosurgeon. And, Carter comes, and 4 years later, the ultimate outsider, Ronald Reagan, wins and leads a true revolution. And in '88, when Reagan leaves office at 65% approval, we see whole contest on the Republican side as to who will be the most deserving heir to the Reagan legacy. And George Bush makes the case, it's my turn. And he wins Ronald Reagan's 3rd term. But in '92, again, Bill Clinton running against Washington very effectively, wins as a Democrat. And in a year that was as fascinating as any political year, fueled in part by the agenda and the leadership of those elected to Congress in 1974, we were starting to address really serious issues. And a fellow came out of Texas, and I'm the first to admit that Ross Perot's tray table is not always in its original upright position, but he did the unthinkable in 1992. He came from 0 on the 18th of February to 1st, leading both Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush by the 10th of June, without spending a nickel on radio or TV advertising of any kind. He did it on the basis of, we were spending more on interest on the national debt that year than we collected in income taxes from states west of the Mississippi, and pointed out that it didn't put a book in a child's hands or put a plane in the air or clear a stream or anything of the sort. It just represented a transfer from people of ordinary income to wealthy bondholders. Then, having made that case, Perot pulled out with one of the truly cockamamie excuses I've ever heard. He said the Republicans are going to sabotage his daughter's wedding. Now, I've been around politics for half a century. I've closed a few saloons at last call. I've sat with people who told me all the mischievous things they want to do to their opponents, like let's order 400 pizzas, COD, to our opponent's headquarters. Let's call forward our opponent's switchboard to a 900 number in New Jersey. But I've never heard anybody, even after a six-pack of Smirnoff, say, let's sabotage our opponent's daughter's wedding. This year, if my luck holds, I will have been married 49 years to a wonderful woman from Texas. I asked my Texas wife, how exactly do you sabotage a Texas wedding other than by showing up sober? I don't know how the hell you do it. So I admire and I admire enormously what the class of '74 in the 94th Congress and those elected in 1974, they changed the Democratic Party, they changed the nation, and for the better. And for that, I am very grateful. I will close with just one statement about Ronald Reagan, why I liked him. I liked covering him. Ronald Reagan was fun to cover in large part because he used to say things that weren't true. Now, there was no attempt to deceive. His deception was not in the man's soul. But along the way, it had been a long way, he picked things up. They got on the 5x8 cards. Sometimes they didn't have a strong empirical foundation to them. One of his statements during the 1980 campaign was, there are 114 taxes on a loaf of bread. There are not 114 taxes on a loaf of bread. Confronted about this by a young UPI reporter, said, Governor, could you tell us your source for that? And the Gipper, with that 10,000-watt grin of his, said, Reader's Digest, April 1956, right next to Humor in Uniform, I think is where it was. We're in Steubenville, Ohio, in September of 1980, is the day Ronald Reagan delivered remains my all-time favorite factoid. Trees cause more pollution than automobiles. We all headed for the phones because we knew this was as good as it was going to get. I mean, you're not going to get much better. I mean, the next time you're in a Jersey Turnpike and your eyes are watering, from a diesel in front of you, blame a pine tree in Maine. That was the life. As luck would have it, our next stop was in Southern California. It was the worst air pollution inversion week they'd had in the Los Angeles basin in 16 months. Went out to Claremont College where Governor Reagan was going to speak, and some wise guy graduate student hung a sign on a tree that said, cut me down before I kill again. And nobody laughed harder than the Gipper. And for that, he has my admiration and appreciation, as do you. Thank you for listening. We've got time for a few questions and answers. I have 3 answers, so if we could match them up with the questions, that would really make it good. So who has a question? Yes, sir.
No clue what's happening here in the Congress. The regional papers that used to have bureaus
Right.
here that covered the state delegations, they're gone. So now the poor voter, the poor citizen, is really in the dark. What's your solution?
Well, my 3-point, I don't have an answer for that, but you identify a problem that is very real, and make no mistake about it. I mean, I worked on Capitol Hill 50 years ago for Bill Proxmire, and you're right. I mean, there were newspapers from Wisconsin with the bureaus here, and you had to answer to them, and they covered you closely, and oftentimes critically, and I don't know that I have a solution. I mean, the newspaper era is over, sadly, and there are very few places where it's flourishing today. And I think that the effort by online news sources to cover it is obviously a step in the right direction, but so many of them are polemicists. I mean, they just have a narrow parochial point of view and not the broader perspective that you talk about. I wish I did have a solution, but I do not. Yes. Sure. Microphone, please. This gentleman in the front row.
Thank you for your talk, Mark. Enjoyed that. If you were one of the questioners at the first Democratic debate next month, what one question would you like to ask whoever's in it at that point?
I don't know. I did, one year I interviewed all the presidential candidates and asked them the same questions. And there are just a few that kind of got a little bit of a different rise out of them. What president of the other party in your lifetime do you most admire and why? What sacrifices would you ask of the American people going forward? In 2002, when the Congress voted to go to war in Iraq, the woman Diana Durja was working with me, and I called 535 offices and asked one question: does the member or the senator have a child in the enlisted ranks of the United States military? Out of 535, one. Tim Johnson, Democratic senator from South Dakota, son Brooks was in the 101st Airborne. We've totally divorced those from power from those we put at peril. And war demands equality of sacrifices. Nothing worse. I was a peacetime Marine. I don't claim any great combat experience, but there's nothing that distresses me more than to hear people talk about, let's send in some force. You're not sending in force. You're sending in men and women who have families, who have futures and hopes and dreams. But so I think, what sacrifice? There's a what's appointment television to you? What do you have to watch? I mean, I want to get a sense of what's the biggest mistake you've made in your public life, and why did you make it, and how do we know you won't make it again? I guess the other one, which is always a good one for any candidate, was, all right, you get elected, and the majority leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the House come to you, and they say, look, your election's important. We got to prove that this place works. We got to prove that the government is responsive. What three things would you do? We've got the votes. Powers expanded, powers contracted, laws repealed, laws passed. What is it? Not 18, not 19, not to, as Mo Udall used to say, caress the erogenous zones of the body politic, with every possible, his left-handed Unitarians against the metric system. Oh, I'm sure, whatever you want. And so what three? What three? So I guess I was watching last night, and I just thought CNN tried to do what Fox had done, in sort of stirring things up, and it just I thought right at the outset. I mean, Donald Trump is Don Rickles for president. I mean, if you want to get, you're wrong on this. Hey, you're dumb, you're stupid, you're ugly, get out of here. And that's it's hard for me to believe if he does win, it repeals everything I've ever known about politics. First, before they vote for you, they have to like you. Secondly, politics is a matter of addition, not subtraction. And the presidency, the higher the office, the more important the individual. Americans have a sense when they're voting for president what kind of a person somebody is, and whether they like that person, trust that person. In 2004, Democratic friends don't like to accept it, but I like beat IQ. They liked George W. Bush more than they liked John Kerry. John Kerry won the debates. John Kerry was smarter. John Kerry was better informed. They decided they liked George W. Bush better. Maybe they shouldn't have. You know, maybe people say, oh gosh, mistake. But I mean, there was no question. That was what the decision was. So I just think anything that does reveal sort of the unexpected in the character. I mean, you got a lot of canned answers last night because people had anticipated questions and they had talking points. I think that's true in all the debates. Just anything that sort of gets a sense of who somebody is and what makes them tick. Last question. Anybody else? Okay. All right. I thank you so much. Great being with you.